Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Terrance Galvin.
Thank you, Blaine. That wasn't too bad. I was more worried about jokes. Well, good evening, bonsoir. This is the talk that I've wanted to give for 18 months because when I came here and did all the interviews for this job, no one ever asked me to present my work. So I may not even be trained as an architect. I told several people on the committee, they asked me everything else. What languages can you speak? How can you get accreditation? What do you know about credit weight? How do you take the bus from the campus to downtown? But no one actually asked me to talk about work. So I'm actually very happy to have an opportunity to show you that I did study architecture, as was said in the summary. And thank you, Blaine. I share the sentiment back. I'm very glad to have met you, and we've become, as you say, good friends, and I'm delighted to be here. And I didn't think of it at the time when I met you either, that we'd ever end up here together at St. Andrews, so that makes it even better. Tonight I want to talk about the idea of architectural education from the ground up, and that's an intentional choice of words because I'm quite different than the previous two speakers in that I approach architecture not as a practitioner as they do, but really as a teacher, and therefore the question of thinking about architecture as a discipline as much as about building the built environment through buildings is it's another lens, and it's an equally important lens to the ones we've been seeing in the past weeks. And in fact, I would say that both Douglas Cardinal and Etienne Gabory really set the stage for the issues I want to speak of tonight because they both, in different ways, underscored the idea that the key in design is still to keep your creative idea and not to have it get compromised, not to lose track of it along the way, not to let other forces reduce the power that you have intuitively in a project. And that came out in both speakers' careers. And it's interesting with Etienne Gabory that at his age of 83, when we first met in Winnipeg and talked a few months ago, he spoke about the idea that for all the projects that he was known for and that have been successful, it still bothered him of all the projects that he tried that he thought weren't as successful. And he built over 350 buildings. But it was interesting to hear someone at his stage in a career reflecting back on it, still saying the times that I didn't get the project in the way that built the way I wanted was when this or this happened. And sometime it was the office getting too big, him losing sight of things. And that was very important for me to hear because it's actually true in teaching architecture in the same way. So, Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet who just has passed away, he speaks about having a farmer's accuracy in his writing. And he came from a long line of farming people as I have myself, and so there's a kind of personal journey embedded in the discussion of studying architecture for each of us. And when Heaney speaks about that farmer's accuracy, he's referring to a kind of down-to-earthness, that ground-up reference, but also in terms of precision. And we're going to come to what that means. Also, Heaney would talk in poetry about poetry's gift for telling the truth. And that leads me to think about architecture's gift lies in part in framing the human situation, first individually and then later collectively. So this picture is a photograph that I took with another professor friend 25 years ago in Peru. And it was a set of women that were going to farm in the fields outside Lima, and they were leaving their babies along this edge. And at first glance, it may appear that the child is alone and has been kind of abandoned. But in fact, the set of photographs that we took to look at this was very different because the child is actually wrapped carefully. The child's put up against that mud wall because they're actually working just on the top right of the image is where the field is. The branch that the woman put down over it is carefully folded to make shade because it's very hot. It's summertime when we're there in the fields. And everything about that is actually at the root of what I would say architecture, I came to understand architecture to be about. So it's not that the child is left alone at the side of the road, which some people in Manhattan thought when I showed this picture a number of years ago. And I couldn't help but feel there was a certain cynicism in not saying that there's actually a beauty in the way many of these children were next to their mothers, and while they were just working, they were able to be in this place. But the clothing, the place she took picked for the placement of the child and the branch with the leaves all add to a kind of architecture that creates an organic situation. And I mean that in the true sense of the word, that there's a kind of harmony and symbiosis between all those parts, including the fact that the mother is just a few steps away and is able to watch over the child. And it's a whole series of those children along this roadside. So now I want to show a series of images from a book called Built by Hand, and they relate directly to this image that I showed, the one previously, because they're all a series of building traditions that develop in different cultures, and as they develop, they have a lot of that farmer's accuracy and a lot of that ground-up idea. We may call them vernacular. I always have been drawn to those building situations where people in local places are able to put things together, and that was my inspiration as a student in school, but it wasn't fully accepted, I would say, or cultivated in my early years of education. People thought that right away you had to kind of forget what you learned before you came to architecture school and then develop this entire other language. It had to be, you know, a certain set of canons, a certain set of architects that were being referenced at the time, and I deeply at that time still felt there was a kind of necessity to get away from European traditions being imported here, cultural assimilation of all kinds, from trying to settle people in Newfoundland to watching the Bedouin being told, you know, go into different cities and stop their practices of being nomadic and so on. So all of those things that I was interested in school, there wasn't really a platform for that in the educational system, but as I started to travel, I was drawn to places like this, and even though these are book images, most of them are places that I've certainly traveled to, studied, gone to with students, done drawings, tried to figure out what they are. So that one is as it says, it's a wind catcher, and the entire city of Hyderabad and many other cities like it have this piece that's propped up. It looks very much like a kite, and kite making and those kind of wind catchers are very similar. And then it's a scoop that goes down through the house and ventilates. Basic, but something very from the ground up about that. The second one here is a granary, and so again you can see that the idea here is to lift the door, have those great rocks that are on the bottom that then the earth sits on with poles, and even the way it's wrapped with the reeds on the third level up, and even the way they pinch it like a beehive in pinching the mud in order to make that form, there's an ornamentation that's integral with the form that comes through that. I'm just trying to work this. Do you know, Kate, which one this is? Do you know? Kate, are you there? Just want to figure out how to get a... Aha, okay, great. This one, Burkina Faso, same idea, but a different form. And so the process leads to the form in all of these cases. And in this case, these are tall. In places like Yemen, they're 6-story earthen buildings. The mezzanine level has the sticks coming out that you can then also use as a ladder and climb out onto. Birds perch on them and again lift it off the ground. And that detail has come to me in many different places of being able to separate off the ground, have ventilation. Straw bale houses use it now, but those kind of earthen square granaries with wooden frameworks and that conical shape, as I say, in countries like Yemen, go 6 stories tall, and their form is about that material. Similarly here, with the way that people make places. So the connection I'm trying to suggest is between that first child sitting in the earth covered by the branch. There's a very close connection between that human habitation and these kinds of buildings. And I'm always searching for that, because the further and further I think we get away from that connection, that architecture is about framing the human situation and the human body, things like Douglas Cardinal's critique that we're disconnected, that we're planning, you know, things around traffic engineering ideas and not human ideas. So that all of this was a kind of discovery of starting to understand that shapes of buildings, ornamentation, the way things are propped up, held up, there's a consistency about that geometry, and each of these is a specialized place. That flat rock with that stick I'll find later in Nova Scotia as a detail for the way fishing sheds, when they go towards the ocean, sit on the rock. They don't get drilled into the rock, they still sit on a rock like that. And if you asked most people about its stability, they would be concerned, but it's a common detail throughout the world. This is a house in Gujarat, and later I'll show a project in another place called Kutch, India, where houses like this that have a round roof and often from thatch in an earthquake that I was involved in Kutch, reconstructing after that earthquake. These kind of walls stood because there's thick earthen walls, and this woman is drawing this all by hand, not with a computer, not with even a ruler. And so the ornamentation is entirely there. It's very subtle, but you can see it throughout the house. And then when it steps in, it becomes a niche for storing things. Many times the house is about that big, and 8 or 10 people will live in a house like that, sleep on the beds, and have all the pots and pans below, and turn around and produce a whole dinner that it would be tough for you to do if you had a fully commercial kitchen. And so all of that relationship between this dado, the way it makes a shelf for the icons, right up to the ceiling, and then the ceiling detail of how a round roof sits on a square building is a common thing to study. In these kind of northern Indian towns, you'll see these multi-story buildings with balconies and with these awnings. And in places like Jaisalmer, the buildings are facing each other on a street, and they'll step up, and each one comes out to cantilever for shade, and out and out. And you can literally reach across on the top level of 2 6-story buildings and hand somebody something in those streetscapes. But that's reverse of what we would want to do here in Sudbury, and thinking about stepping back in order to allow light into the section. It's so hot there that the street section steps up and becomes a facade meeting the other facade. And then there's a wonderful courtyard behind. And this plinth, you know, one of the lessons I've learned is that that plinth with the people sitting there is really already in that building when we have it here. And those things continue to find their way in building traditions that become more and more developed as typologies get more and more complex. And that's a way to see that there is a kind of history of architecture that develops, but that's not the same as thinking that somehow progress means that we leave building traditions behind. That's a nice one, a mosque in Burkina Faso. And this fellow is very tall and very much the same shape as that, which is interesting. But you can't see it unless you look very closely. But this is a stair to walk up to the wall on the roof of the mosque, and that is a log that has been hewn to create the steps. So it's really a ladder as well as a stair. And that's a kind of detail that's consistent with the niches and, again, ornamentation, finishing the roof, protecting it from the rain so it doesn't erode more than it needs to in any given wet season. Another interesting one of a rock, and you can ask yourself when you see an image like that, was the rock here and then someone came along and built this foundation of rock below? Probably yes, but the niche under this rock as a dwelling is, again, a continuation in my mind of that first image I showed of the child in the field in Peru. There was a famous book that came out in around 1964 called Architecture Without Architects, and it was a big exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. And by the time I started university in 1980, it was kind of dismissed, that book, that it was looking at vernacular traditions, and the universities were still very concerned about Bauhaus traditions and early modernism and so on. But that book had a big impact when it came out, and by the time this book came out in the 90s, there was a resurgence of looking at those kinds of traditions. So here, all of these are lime on the front of the houses, and they're cave dwellings. And this is the reverse, and that this is stick structure, but again, being lifted up. It's in Southeast Asia. By being lifted up, this large porch that runs around that house, there's one way in, and then this porch is a big ventilated in-between space, and then all the private rooms are darker under the thatch with a section, and this roof lifts up. So again, and this lifts up here, that's a dormer. So it's ventilated very well in the porch, it's ventilated through the top of the roof, and somewhere, if you remember that church by Gabory last week, that Precious Blood Church, again, I feel that there's a kind of intuition that he had about that form that didn't come from any a priori idea. He had a series of poles, he worked with some contractors, and as they figured out how to make that spiral, which was the plan, that ended up in as unusual a form and as kind of authentic or accurate a form as this would in its own tradition. That's inside that porch, and then you start to see the details of that dormer ventilating. There's a bench all around it, and these are, in Indonesia, beautiful wood joinery, a thatched roof, bent wood, and then ventilation throughout, and then the inner rooms in the center. And many of those are collective families, so they're not just one family house, it's a whole series of families that live together, and that was a common building type. Another one in Indonesia, the captions are useful here because this explains in this house, and there are many of these kind of descriptions of buildings, this is all stick frame, but there's a kind of realm of the gods above, the people living at this level in the middle, and then the animals being down below. And so it's a kind of axis mundi, an axis of the world. It has a thatched roof on the building next to it, but this part is symbolic expression, and it doesn't have to be there functionally as much as it has to be there to unite this kind of harmony between the structure and the form. This one's nice because it's like you took your hair and just pulled it up with a net. In Yemen. So the architect Doshi in India was often drawing turbans in India and then drawing the way to make a roof in buildings in Ahmedabad, and people would get puzzled by that, but he was studying the insulative quality of the turban and then seeing that he could translate that to a kind of double shell in certain structures. And here it's not dissimilar, that with headpieces being worn and protecting your head from the sun to insulate, that now is a larger version of this. That's a net, and it's woven, and it's all tied up from palm rope to guard against the wind and the storm. So it's really tied down. And in Nova Scotia, 25 years later, I saw a building on the coast that served hamburgers, just hamburgers, and fish, of course. And the fellow he designed the building so he could lift the porch up so they became the walls and shuttered the windows, take the eave of the roof and fold it down, and he could walk around that building in 2 or 3 minutes when a storm was coming, and the entire thing folded up and got tied down, and all his details were boat details because he was a fisherman. And so that's the version in this culture, and we have versions in ours in different places. Mauritania, again, the beautiful idea that there's always an important place that's a threshold, and walking through the door of a building, whether it's this church or the new School of Architecture, that there should be a kind of symbolic entrance. Ours has been locked for 10 days, but we're working on getting the doors open. And so when you come through this lime is also partly protecting. You step over that threshold, this gets worn with time. In French, the word seuil is always a beautiful word. I think seuil as a threshold really describes it much better than threshold as a onomatopoeia. But this notion of the stairs coming on both sides, landing, coming through the door, and then seeing it in its more full form, that door again becomes protection of the lime, a place of ornament, a place of color, and then that form rubbing these with mud. You've all seen these buildings often get rubbed again every few years to protect them against weathering and so on. And so that's a palette of images that from the time I left University of Toronto and then went out to Halifax, I made more of a connection that there was a valid line of thinking through the history of architecture that I would pursue. And so the differences were, in Toronto, at the time, we were asked to do things in first year like design a settlement for 10,000 people, and I would take a potato and cut it out and make stamps like these ornaments and fail. And then another time we were asked to stay away from studying laneways or anything that were in Toronto because they were just service laneways. But most of my experience that's equivalent to this was growing up in a very Sicilian neighborhood in Toronto in the East End, and all the fun we had was the laneways, right? We played in the laneways. The Italians made wine cellars on a weekend, to avoid the building code. You fix cars in there. So all of those garages that were mechanic places to play. Once you go to Quebec and here, that they're hockey places, of course, right? The lanes, they're protected from the street. In those days, people like my parents didn't think they were dangerous. They thought that it was better than being on the street where the traffic was. But there was a life in the lanes that was very much an important set of images that I brought to architecture school, and all of that, there was no place for it. And I could say the same thing in this curriculum. My reaction in making the curriculum for this school is that all of those things that you bring to the place, they matter most. They don't matter least. So that's why we said in the video that we made with Chris for the portfolios, if you hunt, if you fish, if you sit in the land a certain way, if you come from a First Nation culture where you learn to do certain things, that is the source that you draw upon for design. It's not the thing we're going to say leave and now we're going to design something else, because I honestly didn't know at that point what would that be. I was very puzzled for a few years, looking for a language of what architecture might be as I was trying to go from one school to another. But in Nova Scotia, what was refreshing was that we did things like we apprenticed with boat builders, and we went out and built things in communities, and that little restaurant that folded up like a boat. It was all of those things that later I understood there was a term called material culture. Henry Glassy developed that down in southern states, and then he was teaching people that were coming back to Canada, who I'll show in a minute, like Robert Mellon. And in the meantime, when I came out of school, I thought I would become an architect and go to an office and work and then write my exams. But I had an opportunity to go to Peru instead at that time and then work on this interesting grant proposal in La Católica, which is the Catholic University of Peru, and it was to build earthquake-resistant material, lightweight material, and they were very good at the engineering part, and they invited Technical University of Nova Scotia to go to do the cultural part, which even that question was interesting to me, that they actually knew that they knew how to build, but they knew that when people came to a squatter town, some of them were from the Andes, some of them were from the jungle, some of them were from the coast, and then all places in between. And that mix meant there was not one size fits all. There wasn't one building type, because in the jungle you build with jute, jute, and vines, and the roofs are metal. And on the coast in Peru, it hadn't rained in 50 years there with the El Nino phenomena getting pushed up into the Andes, so the coast was dry. So if you were trying to look for a common language of architecture, there wasn't one, and at least they were enlightened enough to invite a group of architects to come together with them, and then we studied seismic shapes and what kind of things would work in a local material way. And later, as I say, I would start to understand that in terms of part of material culture as a way of working. And I'll come to that term in a moment. This is the setting. So again, out of school where you're designing things that are kind of, museums for large cities. And then you land here in the desert, two of us, and during almost a civil war, because the Shining Path, it's also the year that those of you in the audience that remember the Sendero Luminoso were a very tough terrorist group, and they were all throughout Peru. So we landed in a place like this, and this was the group that came to meet us, these children in a school, and the building that they had was this building. And the first thing they didn't want to hear about was that we were going to tear that building down and build a new building. Much like the corner of Elm and Elgin. The strategy was to keep the things that are there because they matter. And in a case like this, where people are in a squatter town and they're fighting to get all of that material to put this together, they were very proud of that. So the idea that you'd say, I'm going to take it down and build something new, already would set you off on the wrong foot. So we didn't say that. We said, this is a very interesting building. What is it? And they said, we meet here on Sundays. It's a school during the week. It's like a one-room schoolhouse, all different classes. We have our political meetings here. So we said, it's really a gathering hall. And they said, yes, it's not a school. It's really our multi-purpose place. So we said, well, let's build onto that, but in this local material that we discovered. But the first 6 months I was there, we went around to 8 different schools, and this one is the first one that we replaced a roof on out of straw, because all of those roofs, this is 1988, they were made from asbestos, and even though Canada had banned asbestos for in-house in Canada, they were kind enough to send it to countries like Peru, and they were putting it on their schools and breathing all this stuff, and I walked in and thought, that's strange, we're not using it at home, let's get it out. So we had to write a report, on those grants every few months, quarterly, and my first 2 quarterly reports said that we'd taken 8 roofs off the schools, and they got a bit nervous, saying, we gave you $350,000 to go and build, why are you unbuilding? But we had to unbuild before we could build. So we took those roofs off, and then we made roofs out of straw, and because I said it doesn't rain in Peru, that solved the roof problem, was a kind of filter for light, and this was the straw. So Villa El Salvador is the name of this place, and there was a squatter town of 350,000 people, so the size of Halifax today, and they would have these things which they call invasions, and groups would come. This entire group came overnight, so that's the squatter town. That looks like it's the mountains in the distance with a silhouette, but that silhouette was the existing squatter town, and groups would get together and plan for weeks and months, and then come all at once, with the political idea that if you were so many, the government couldn't just come and bulldoze you off. But if you came in 2 or 3 families at a time, they wouldn't let you settle. So when they settled, the very first thing they did was took this straw, estera, which was in kind of 4 by 5 foot panels, and they would first, as you would, that child, don't forget, wrapped in the clothes, you would wrap something around yourself like a shawl, and they would bend it. So the first stage of that is bent. There's one where there's another piece now added on, and then eventually they'd get a frame and start to tie them together to strips of wood they'd find, and then this becomes the next prototype, and so on. But still, no water, they're entirely off-grid, no electricity, no toilets, so it's not a pleasant situation. People kind of romanticize the squatter towns and say things like, they're really doing well on their own and let's leave them alone. And I'd be the first to say, let's not go into a place without an invitation to have a discussion. But they're not perfect places, and then people are trying to live in those, to go to work in Lima and then take the bus 3 hours each day, each way. So you'd work 12 hours a day and take 3 hours of a bus to get here and 3 hours of a bus to go back in the morning. So that means your day's 18 hours a day, 6 days a week. And this is the another one of the children that we got to know well in the neighborhood. That's her place. She's going to spend her life growing up there. And that little school that they had, that's not in this picture, was one of the only public buildings, but each neighborhood had one of these that was a kind of gathering hall. And so with La Católica, we developed a system that was based on that same straw panel you saw, but putting it in a wood frame and just very little water because they're in the desert and they had to pay for water. So unlike using steel or concrete, which were the things being pushed by different government agencies from around the world, we used the Astera, we made this wood, we poured by hand a concrete foundation for that, embedded a piece of wood from the jungle, Madeira, that was a very common wood in there, very accessible and easy, and like mahogany, super hard and didn't warp. Those of you that chiseled maple last week in the program, Madeira's harder, so your hands would hurt more. But we had to cut that by hand, made the concrete by siphon by hand, and then on the top of that Astera, you put a little bit of mud and then a finishing coat. And that finishing coat is very much like all the images I showed you earlier. It's where you put color, you put ornament, it can have texture, can be sponged. So that was the logic for this system. And then on the top, just like your collarbone, a collar beam that would run around it to tie it together and stabilize it. And then we put raw bamboo. There was lots of bamboo from the jungle, so we just cut bamboo like straws, ran bamboo across there. And then this last one looks like the asbestos panel that I was critiquing, but we made it from jute. So we went into the Amazon and found places that just sold copious amounts of jute, the vine, and we brought it back, and just like a baking process, we took an asbestos thing and made a mold from it to get a nice jute one, and then we would just make a mulch with the jute wet, and when it dried, it would, in the sun, it would form a tile, and then you would just take an auger and make a hole in it, and then tie it, lash it down to the bamboo. So everything was local, and in that 6 months that we were doing this, the price of steel had gone up 400%, right? Because rebar was going up, and if any of you have ever traveled to South America, your first impression is to see these buildings with all this rebar sticking up, and it looks like there's a lot of construction going on. But then as you ask more, those houses have been like that 10, 15, 20 years. So in fact, they're not ever getting completed because, as we said in the introduction, those things aren't appropriate. They're not appropriate technology, they're not affordable. And so this was a kind of intense experience in starting to do that. Then the community only had Sunday off, so we met every Sunday, and people started building these panels and said, we know how to build those. And then we had time, and so we traveled all around Peru, from the coast to the jungle, to look and see. That was called quincha, that material, and we found out that it was a material they used to use. So this house is made from quincha, but it looks like a Tudor, English Tudor house. You'd think it was plaster. But quincha is that straw. It's actually that bamboo. The straws of bamboo are in that wall, like wattle and daub, and then they put mud on it, and then these were cross braces in those days to stabilize it, and then this, of course, with the glass becomes ornament. But all of that's quincha, and if you look at it carefully, you start to see there's a modular panel, because the panels they would build were about that big. So these are panels. So when you really got a chance to see a building where the wall was broken, there was this entire sense of it being on a frame with the bamboo. And as we looked into it, we found that Lima Cathedral, that has a beautiful, beautiful barrel vault that would have made Louis Kahn weep, half a block long, this beautiful barrel vault. And when it was broken in the corner, we climbed up with a camera and took pictures, and you could see that the entire barrel vault, this shape, but that long, was all made from long bamboo. And it was all just one perfect arc, like a boat, but made from bamboo. And because it didn't rain, it had not been destroyed inside. And when we took a picture of that, this is before Photoshop, today they'd think you were lying, but we took pictures, and on Sunday when we got together, we showed them this and said, Lima Cathedral's made from that quincha. And they said, well, if the cathedral's made from it, then we'll give it a shot, because we had to build a relationship with the people who had thought that this material was taking them back and making them peasants, and they wanted to move forward with concrete and steel. And that's the story. I learned it then, and we'll have that conversation many times with students in the next years, because people, in some strange way, in many countries think that progress is somehow tied to all the things that they don't have. And part of this observation is that appropriateness is about the things that you have and how to use them appropriately, and not think that if you jump on the bandwagon for steel because it's cheap this year, that it won't be that way in 5 years. So, working with La Católica, we made these panels, and what was great, they had a seismic room larger than this altar platform, and we'd be able to build things full scale. put the Richter scale on them, test and see where they crack. So all of that was the science behind testing what kind of panels belonged in the corners, where could you put openings, symmetrical. Openings were always symmetrical, so if you put a door in one wall, you try to have a door in the other wall because the forces would shake equally, and then you wouldn't have a problem of cracking on one side. So they knew all of that, and we developed a kind of lexicon of modules. So the only drawing we ever did for this building was this drawing, and each of those is a module of a panel on a grid, and we said, let's make a square room, and let's make another square room, because we could find that we could span that distance with bamboo, and then this module is half of that square again, and this one in between, like an atrium in our new building, is just stepping up, and you can see it here. It steps up like that wind catcher to provide ventilation and air, the middle part of the building. So that was the simple building. This was the building that they already had, that was that school. And another one of our problems was how to build toilets, because again, in the desert, I went to see WUSC, World University Services Canada, and the fellow said, no problem, you just have to go and get all these people on the grid, and then we can have toilets. And I said, but the problem is they're off grid, and they live in a squatter town, so we need to do toilets that have no water. And he said, well, I can't help you. So we went away, and I wrote another letter. That was the next quarterly report. You know, thank you for the asbestos, and WUSC is absolutely, if any of you work for WUSC, I'm sorry, they were not helpful in any way. So we said, let's go and find a way to build dry toilets. And a fellow tapped me on the shoulder coming out of that meeting and said, we've been building Pozo Negros, these dry toilets, for centuries, and I'll meet you on Sunday. And he helped us, because the sand was a good leaching field, build these 2 sets of toilets. They leached out into 2 different circular pits that you would dig, and just like you all have cisterns around here, you would make that. One would fill up for an amount of time, and when it would fill up the hole, you would just move the bamboo pipe to the next one, and that would fill up, and the other one would percolate and leach out into the sand in the field through tubes, and that worked perfectly fine. And so that was an example. And then they had to buy water from a truck that came from the city, and so the very first thing we did was build the water tank to build the concrete foundation, and we gave the children a little spigot, so in the morning when they would come in, they would be able to water the tree. And they asked for a tree. We didn't put a tree in the courtyard at first, but they said, we really want to have one tree, and we want to water that tree as part of our going to school in the morning. And that seemed like a very good idea. And then in the morning, they'd come in this gate, take some water, sit around this little place that was their scale, and you'll see in a moment, and then water the tree. And the other 2 things that came in were a light and a flag, bandera, a flagpole. And so I don't have those pictures here, but we had many, many meetings on Sundays where we get together and we'd make a model, they'd cut it up with knives, make it again for us, and they would tell us where they were hoping to have the things. So that way of working was liberating from coming out of architecture school, where I thought you had to draw everything first. But at the end of the day, like a barn raising, everybody came together and they built this in 2 weekends. So all the panels were made, the frames went up. That's the little place for the watering hole to take water. There was a slope because of the way the building was mapped out, so that was steps, and this was all pounded earth as a surface. And then that shows you that relationship, the kind of panel modular quality of panel opening for window, panel opening for window, and then braced on the corner ones. That was similar and had been done for centuries in the old Kinshasa buildings. So by the end, as I say, that was 1 weekend to frame, get the straw on it, then put the plaster on that. We had 1 ladder, got the ventilation box done, and at the end, this is a line. You can't see it in the picture, but this child is running her hand along a line, and so they then did that 2 different colors. They kind of scored a line in the wall and put a nice color, a child warm earth tone color on the lower level, and then did the rest of it in a rougher texture. And bamboo on the roof, and that jute as panels. This is just one example. We had each group was called a group number, and we did many variations to see what are the relationships between that existing building and arrangements around this circular courtyard. And the idea behind this project wasn't to build a building, it was to reintroduce Kinshasa into the community. So we made pamphlets. Today we would have made videos, but in those days we made pamphlets and we held community meetings. And actually people then took that on, and we did a few other projects, and one of them was to figure out how to take an existing concrete building with rebar and then add this system onto a second floor. and another one was to take any of those concrete buildings and add onto the back of it. So it became a typology study, and we did 3 or 4 exercises, and over 200 projects got built with that kinship from the community then accepting to take it on, and they knew how to build it better than we. And that was the idea behind the project. It wasn't to make a building per se. The building was a prototype or a model, and that model then was replicable as a modular system, and it got repeated in many, many different settings. So that shows it there. That's the panels. And the elevations were fun because the children were part of the whole process, so they really wanted this window because they wanted to look out to the soccer field, and they could see out this, whereas larger people couldn't, so the kids were always around there. And the teacher would be able to open the top part of the window, and kids could sit along there. So that's a score line for the plaster finish, and that's a little section to show you the desert with all of those other Astera buildings around. And then the languages window and that little ventilating box, and these opened as well to ventilate through there, and it formed a courtyard. Because even in a place like this, there was no context of other buildings nearby, so they wanted to have some relationship between that existing building and a gate that they could lock at night for protection and just not having things stolen and so on, because they were all strangers in relation to each other, and there was a lot of things that happened and got stolen and so on. So without putting heavy security, it was just a notion that you made a courtyard and you could pass through that courtyard, and then that child could be entering there and walking through to the next group. So 2003, Robert Mellon published a great book called Tilting, and it's about tilting Newfoundland. And by that time, as I said, I started reading a lot in the 1990s about that term material culture from Henry Glassy, and then Robert Mellon, as an architect, studied with him and then came back. This is Nova Scotia, but it's similar to the coast of Newfoundland that he's looking at where tilting is. And now we'll start to look at the idea that there's this land form set of rocks that step down to the sea, and how buildings situate themselves has a lot to do with that from the ground up, or that farmer's accuracy. So Peggy's Cove has a famous lighthouse. If you've ever been to Peggy's Cove, there's a little restaurant there. And at one point, they made the mistake of hiring an architect from outside there who came and finished the restaurant. And he put the door on the wrong side that was always against the wind. And for a couple of weeks, you open the door, and everything blew off all the tables. And they said, thank you, and then put the door back on the other side. And he went away. And they said, bye to geez, bye. So that's a vernacular that we'll all share. And tilting, so that tilting's even further. That's really out in the middle, off the coast of Newfoundland, out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And it's the kind of place where there's blizzards there on summer solstice. Seriously, I've called Robert Mellon. He'll say, I'll call you back in a week. We're in the middle of a blizzard. It's a harsh place. But out of that harshness, all of these buildings got hauled around. So this book in Tilting is describing how people took buildings, houses, and put them on sleds and hauled them around the island. And you'll see a map in a minute. What's interesting about this is that Joey Smallwood, then as the premier at that time, was part of that assimilation as well, right? He thought that people should move to the city in St. John's in the 50s, have an economy that was metropolitan and city-based, and it's no different in my mind than the Bedouin or many of the First Nation treatises where people that were moving and hunting and having a life that was cyclical and seasonal and organic are forced to settle. And so Joey Smallwood is the kind of antithesis of this tilting idea, because people would take things like this fishing stage and they'd move it. It says, shifted closer to the shore. So there's the rock that Robert draws, the house, the little building on its lot, and these things keep getting moved around depending on the context. That's a map. So it's a great map to show you that these houses were here and they get hauled there, and then they may get hauled away again. And so in relation to the harbor, where this is Tilting Harbor, all of those buildings get pulled across by humans and horses and brought to all different places. So Robert Mellon took the time to draw a map like this, which showed all the relationships, because it was a dynamic process. It wasn't build your house and sit fixed. It depended on many, many economic and climate factors. But because Robert is an architect and he was interested in how to draw the material of that culture, he started doing things like this, drawing the line of the boat sitting in the water, drawing these cribs that are filled with rocks that seeing how the ladder that's made by the fishermen is the same technology as the boat, and that they're held up on sticks, and that when you look on the inside of the way this little building here is framed, it's all very down-to-earth trusses, bracing, There's a kind of directness about all of that, which is also reflected in the tectonics of the boat and the cribs. And when a storm comes, these things blow away, and they're meant to blow away. You don't try to keep them and force them there, and the cribs, the rocks will stay, that'll blow away, and you build it again. And that's a lesson, you know, this kind of precariousness of a building straddling this platform becomes itself part of the boardwalk as you move through it, and this really leads. There's a nice place down by French River, that fish and chip place, that, where is that, Blaine? At Killarney, and there's that little building again that opens up on both sides, and you look through to that. That reminded me a lot of these kind of places that are throughout the East Coast that many of you know. And then Robert would draw the details. So part of Henry Glassey's observation was that the way somebody made a rake to rake the field was then translated into the way they made the fence for the house, and then that was translated into the way they made the wall by weaving the wall out of wood, and then that was translated to the way they'd make the furniture. So it's an obvious observation in this tradition of building, but it was really helpful for me to read Glassey and then see how Robert Mellon was taking the time and the care to draw all of these details, how they're nailed, what's the thickness of the wood, where does the rock stay, and that power of observation. As I say, for Seamus Heaney, it's about the accuracy of language and precision, and for us, is to train ourselves to see in a way that doesn't miss the details of things. And the bias in this, of course, is that we live through things. And so studying things in their profundity is a way into an architecture world, and that's one reason why we make things as a way to get knowledge of them. Reading about something is quite different from making it. And again, that's a foundation for this school, but it's growing out of many people's work, including this. Nice image here that you can appreciate. So someone has an old dory, and then they use the boat, they bury it in the hill, and then that becomes their cabbage cellar. But taking the time to actually draw this, you know, if I showed you this image from the outside and said it was a cairn where Irish kings had been buried for the past 3,000 years, it would be very similar. And so that space of the underside of the hill was an important piece of that relationship between the land and the cellar and the things it was protecting. So they had a show of tilting in Newfoundland. It didn't travel, it was hard for that show to travel with all the things with it. But when they held the show in Newfoundland, I was very happy that they put all the objects. It wasn't just the drawings, but they brought in dories, they brought in the wheelbarrows, they constructed pieces of the sheds, they flipped things over and made them into all the tools. So the rake, that rake and the plow and the wall, and then the drawings that Robert did, that's the way they presented the show, which was actually a tighter fit between the things and the drawings than just showing a book by itself. Another project in 2001, and this is all, they're all separate pieces, but the thread that's running through them is this desire to really be in a place, and through not being from there, but when you travel, if you land with your sketchbook and a camera and a critical eye, and you question everything, all the assumptions that are made, and you try to suspend your prejudices, and you're just aware that you're in a place for the first time, there's a kind of acuity, that accuracy again, that comes from being new to a place. I've had the luxury of having that for about a year. I'm getting acclimatized now, but the first time you're in a place and it's all new, there's a kind of heightened awareness that I'm sure you've all experienced in places, and I always enjoy that time because it does dull with repetition and rhythm and so on. But that earthquake in Kutch was the next one, where we had been working from McGill with a series of architecture students and architects like Balkrishna Doshi in Ahmedabad, and we had a grant to go and do something else, and when the earthquake happened, I wrote to CEDA, the agency, LACTI, Canadian Development Agency, and asked could we redirect the grant to respond to the earthquake, because we were in a village recording relationships between these families in a flour mill, and instead we redirected and got to go here very quickly, like within 2 weeks. And the earthquake had been affected the city, and it also affected 2 or 3 outlying regions. And the politics in the city, and this is always the same story, was so complex that a year and a half later, the city was still trying to figure out where they would put the people after the earthquake. And you know some of that story. They always want to relocate. Government agencies usually say, you are here, but let's relocate. And my response to that has always been, if you're a fisherman and you live on a coast and there's a tsunami or a tornado, and someone says to you, let's move 200 miles inland where you don't have your livelihood and you don't have your landscape and you don't have that relationship to place, what would you possibly do there? And yet, every project that I've ever been involved in, and I mean every single one, has always had this as some underlying assumption, that there's been an earthquake, so they wanted to take people from that region and move them a couple of 100 miles inland and build houses for them and give them to that as if that's a gift. But it's actually a colonial attitude, it's an assimilation process, and then you move people, and I collect other photos that I won't show tonight, which are funny things, like they go and give all the Bedouin pickup trucks and say, stop messing around and being Bedouin, just drive to the market and put your camels away. And the Bedouin are clever, so they take their camels and they put them in the pickup trucks and they drive them to the market. I have all those photographs that I send to the government agencies because it's fun to say, like, here's what you did with your money, but now here's what they're doing, and that's kind of interesting, isn't it? So that's one. The best one I know is the group that went in the 60s and told everybody that in order to practice contraception in a village that they should all take, they should use condoms. So they introduced a truckload of condoms, they put them in the village, and everybody was sitting around in all their regalia, and they presented this, and they said to everyone to use the condom. They took a stick and they showed them, take this stick, and then here's how you use a condom, and they put it on. They said, please, to reduce your population because you're not surviving, next time you have sex, please use this condom. Do you all understand? They said, no problem. Yes, we got it. And they went away. The government went away. You know where this story's going. And they came back 10 months later, and the population had gone slightly up. And this is a serious documentary. So CETA says, we're puzzled. How can the population go up? Well, I knew where it was going, like a punchline. So the great thing is they went back to the village, all these people in black suits with little thin ties, British accents, and they said, what's happening to you people? And they said, well, we're doing what you said. And as they went around, everybody taken a stick, put it outside their hut, put the condom on it, and they were at home. That relationship is humorous, right? But it actually, as an architect, I've been involved in that every project. So there's two different symbol systems, right? And you have to be able to think about how to translate, bridge, synthesize, move between them. But I'm always on the side of the people wanting to stay in a place in a serious way, because moving, even after an earthquake, we weren't there for that first 2-week period, so people had buried the dead, cleaned up the rubble, and then we went in as architects because we do have an expertise in design, as we should, and that expertise was about trying to help the families relocate where they were, but sometimes it gets funny. One person said, I really don't like my brother-in-law, and I live across the road from him. So in the new plan, can I move 2 houses over? And that's the kind of thing that's charming, so you say, no problem. But we sat on the floor and took some push pins and just made a drawing where everybody would go back and rebuild. And then that's what happened in the rural area. In the city area, they were still trying to figure out where to put these people in a new place. And in this place, we went in here, and this is that round house, very similar to the one I showed earlier, with its roof missing, because that had fallen in, collapsed as a thatched roof, but that's that same kind of wall with the decoration and the niches and the icons. And we started doing reconstruction with no money from grants, and Balkrishna Doshi just said, let's just do this work. It's important. So what we did here was we went to this place called Ludia that was one of the areas affected, and they have these beautiful round houses with thatched roofs on them. And this is the plan that we laid out again to rebuild the hamlet with the people. And these are the kind of drawings, rocks, push pins, and we kind of laid out where people would go. But then they know all the rest of this because they make these fantastic clothes, great jewelry, great textiles, fantastic ornamentation, right? The relationship between that textile and that wall is obvious. And the thatched roofs are pole houses, so they have a round wall, a central pole, and that holds the roof. And you'll see in a minute, I don't have it. Oh, terrible. Okay, I'm missing one slide. The slide that I would show you is that process of, because they have made these so many times, it was easy to do a sequence drawing, and we showed how you build the earthen wall, you put a pole in the middle, and just like a teepee or a tent, you then run guy poles up to that, and then bring that back down, tie it to the earth wall, and then put the thatch roof back on it. So over 300 houses in 4 or 5 hamlets were rebuilt, and we were really there kind of working with the people and learning the system of building as much as they knew how to do it. They were teaching us. It's not the other way around. But in doing that, as I say, some of the things like relationships between buildings, where water would slope, certain building code issues. There's a set of things that would get interesting in that project, but it was very much a reciprocity. And in this project, the Gabourey one, I think it's a cousin to that set of round houses, because he didn't show this in detail last week, but that brick wall is a spiral. The plan's a spiral, so that brick wall is slopes, so it keeps stepping up as it goes around. It's not uniform. And those poles, which you can start to see the planes of that roof, I still asked him, I think it's one of his trade secrets, so Gabri didn't really tell me how they worked out that geometry, but those tall poles that run from here to the roof, they managed to get them twisted and create that spiral effect so that that form that comes up to here, like a witch's hat, and ends in that kind of geometry, is beautiful. It's crafted. It has to be thought about on the site. The form comes out of the process. It's not a priori. And then the skylight, letting the light into there, is the kind of invention that may not be in those more vernacular buildings I showed because of things like glass. But it's a kind of hybrid between thinking of two kinds of tectonics. And what I really wanted to show on this slide is that the thickness of those shingles, that church was built in the 60s, the shingles are this thick, and they've worn down for 45 years. But you know, you could make a much thinner skin as a building, but the fact that they're that thick, and that lets you see the profile, and then their shingle here turning to brick, that story is actually really important as that form goes. So all that wood, choosing the cedar, not zinc, you know, in that case, working with the local material, seeing that you could shingle that form, all of those things are part of that building's imagery and identity and cultural symbolism. Many of you may know this building, the Museum of Anthropology by Erickson, but in a series of lessons, if this is kind of 6 lessons in the way to see material culture in different places, and architecture from the ground up. Yesterday we watched the film Totem in the design studio, and again, I mentioned to a few of you, this is a building, it's almost not a building. It's a shelter and a cover for those objects, and whether those totems belong in a museum as opposed to their real site, which is what that film was about, is a question. But the question here architecturally is that once Erickson accepts that program, he's able to make these tall concrete columns and have the building pretty much be glass, so that you never really feel that that you're in an enclosed room, but you're watching through a series of planes, the totems themselves, and you get very interesting connections between objects. These are the concrete structural columns on the outside with their trabeated beams, and that simple system ties these together and then lets pure light in between these ribs. Vancouver is milder than our climate, certainly, but the interesting idea is that as an architect, he held control of that structure, and this whole thing is just one ramp where you walk in the front door and you walk along the ramps, and the objects are displayed here for you to read about their narratives. And then you get these views through the building, so the landscape continues, and things like the canoe or other artifacts are then part of that set of walls, but they're not really separating and enclosing. They're part of the, they're also totemic themselves, in that they're kind of tall. They don't have the same narrative as the totem. But once you go outside that building, because these are all objects that are in that site, Haida objects, and so something like this trabeated piece, with the carving on the front and there, you can see that this building, and whether he said that or not explicitly, wouldn't matter. The point is that somehow there's a tectonic connection between an architect seeing something like that and loving these. And Erickson also traveled a lot to Japan, and he was very interested in Japanese tatami mats and Japanese shadows and things that weren't shiny but things that were dull as luster, and overhangs in Japanese architecture. All of that comes into play in getting a commission like this, I would argue, and then making a building that's that connected as a metaphor. This is nice too, that the stair kind of comes up and keeps going, so you always flow through the space, you don't just dead end. And then this is a beautiful object that he made a special room for that's round off of the stair, and if you know it, great carving, right? It's one of the creation stories about these figures in a clamshell and this great bird that's sitting on this. But as you see it in the round, Erickson's good design sense in this from the ground up manner allows him to put that together so you see it in the round, and as you move around the sculpture, which like a totem is meant to be seen in the round and not up against a wall, you move around the back of that bird head, and now it's a mask and a face the other way, and now the arms become wings as you come around it, and so do the figures climbing out of trying to get out of the shell that the eagle's sitting on. So beautiful object, but what I want to really show is that, and beautiful narrative, but the way that he sets this piece here allows you to move around it. This is sand, and then it gets natural light from the skylight so that you get a juxtaposition like this, which you would have a different effect if it was outside. So certainly by putting it inside, we lose something, but the way he's tried to create the connection between outside and inside is respectful of each of the artifacts as a piece. And that's an attitude that I think goes in a lot of the architects who I would point towards, who really take time to look at something not just as a general collection, but as specific pieces, because every moment in the building has a potential from the entrance to these big glass pieces to let you see something and experience it in a very sensorial way. And that's the other half of this. I think that architecture, straddles somewhere between language and description and also sensation. And so we have these responses as we visit buildings that move us because we can describe them. We can say that Science North is a metaphor of a snowflake, but we can also walk up the ramp and in a very phenomenological way experience what that means, feel the movement, and when you then see the relationship between a ramp and a split rock, or here the totem, or these big trabeated beams that then sit in the landscape, from this end, when you come up the hill, they really then aren't large elevations. They kind of become growing out of the hillside. And so it's all very calibrated. Another building that I've spoken about a couple of times, but mostly this is for the first-year students who are now studying architecture here for the first time. This building is a bath in the hills in Vals in Switzerland. But again, when I first saw this building published in magazines, they show it on its own as if it's sitting in the middle of a field and that it's a beautiful object. But in fact, nothing is further from that truth, because when you go to visit there, this is the setting of the hills, and these are these little shacks that are made from stone. And this is gneiss, it's the stone taken from the hill, and all these roofs are that stone with very simple building forms, and those granges that are storage go all the way up the hills to, well, the mountain, and that you see that one of those roofs there. And Zumthor's genius in this project is to take that stone, but not put it in the conventional way on the roof, but to actually cut the whole building out of the hill and then reconstitute the hill as a building. And that's one of the great things about architecture. As I say, it frames the human condition, and we rework things. We don't just accept them. The hill is beautiful by itself, but actually remaking the site by carving the rock out of the hill and then building this bath makes you register both more strongly than if it were just one or the other. So this is the kind of building that's there. You see them, as I say, they're all over. And when you look out through here and walk through here and hike, the creek, the water is streaming down those mountains. And when you come by little farmhouses, they're as carefully made as those first images I showed you. The stairs carefully made, the balconies carefully made, the windows have boxes, they're all framed, that's the level of ornament, the stone is on the roof, the chimney's made from that, it's monolithic, and then you get to Vals. And so there is a connection again, a direct connection between that building and this building, but Zumthor, because of his training himself to see, but being from that region, each of his projects, he's kind of tackled a material. So he said, I'm only going to make this building out of stone. Another project of his as a chapel, he said, I'm only going to make that out of wood. And these are quite intentional exercises to see, can you take a material and make everything from it and see how far that goes. So in wood building, we made joints for years without nails or fasteners. And so that spirit comes out in projects like this. So you see, again, now the juxtaposition between the cragginess and the organic quality of the hill and the trees versus this very, like you could cut this, out of cheese blocks and not get straighter lines. And so controlling stone like that is not an easy thing unless you work with the tradespeople. And then the windows are these big windows that let you look at those other buildings in the distance. And there's only two things you do in this place. You either are in the bath, hot, cold, and warm bath, like a Roman bath, or you lounge and look out at this landscape. And the relationship between them is dramatic because it's changing all the time. This is the water, and that's that stone of gneiss in the area. And they do have the bath there because they also produce Vals water, like Vichy water. So it's mineral water from Vals, comes from the top of those mountains, and flows down through this area. So they had a thermal bath there from the 50s, but they made a very white Le Corbusier building on pilotis with a big ramp, and you drove up under it, and it really looks like it's a foreign object. And then you walk into this as the extension through the same lobby, and then you're in this world that's all one material. It's all stone, and it's all cut up, and it's that same gneiss, but rather than pack it on the roof, Now it's sliced and incredibly controlled so that all the details, this for instance is a control joint in the ceiling, so that slab of concrete lets a little bit of light through, and this is your experience. The wall is lifted away from the ceiling. Frank Lloyd Wright did that in many buildings, and Zumthor does that in a very minimal controlled way. So you get the railing reflection and one of these beams of light, and the only thing he puts in that's artificial, these little holes are real, but he puts blue lights on the top because he went and traveled to Turkish baths and saw other buildings, and that kind of beautiful ceramic and the bluish light and colored light, he wanted to recreate. So it's the only place, I would say, that does something that's not just itself. So the sun comes in through these blue lights, and the glass gives a filtered color that you'll see in a minute. Now that's interesting because we're thinking about a fireplace in the phase 2 of our own building, so that's the pool, that's the water, that's the stone. And then when he makes a fireplace, it's the same tectonic, right? Just now it's a column of stone with this part, stepping back to allow fire to be in the lounge. That's his sketch because he was digging. Seamus Heaney writes a famous poem called Digging with His Pen, about writing as opposed to his father digging with a spade. And in a way, Zumthor understands that this project is about removal from the hill. So he digs it into the hill, and he does a charcoal drawing that basically then shows you the blue areas where the water will be, and they're all different experiences. Some have petals, some are very tall and they have echoes, some you can only swim into as one person at a time, so it can't be the crowd. And in some of them, they pipe in sounds, and it sounds like standing inside a whale. Although I've never stood inside a whale, but I imagine if one did, it would sound like that. And so there are these fantastic moments, but the program, you couldn't really have a simpler program in that everywhere you go in this building, you return to that main pool, so that's like the piazza in the bath, and there you see the blue of that light. So on a gray day, and this part of Switzerland gets many gray days too, on a gray day you still get this effect of a kind of bluish mystical light. That's the plan then when he draws it, but you can still feel, the word for this is poché. You take something like a grapefruit and you carve out of that. So if you carve into a hill, that poché is taking the material away. And this plan couldn't be a plan of putting a building on the site. It's really about pochéing out and getting the space from within. And then that leads to beautiful details, which again, come from the process and not from some magazine idea. And in here, this is now the minerals leaking through. So he puts a piece of brass here and lets that mineral stain the concrete wall, and that gives you a rhythm, and then they put lights along there, and that's your path into the bath. So you pass this set of mineral stains, it's telling you mineral water's there and you're going to the mineral bath. And then this is the wall that gets those mineral stains as well. So you get a kind of reddish, there's some sulfur in the water, and it's the minerals. So he puts the material of stone as a backdrop to allow this patina and aging to happen. And again, that then reflects the process of the mountains that are millions of years old, producing the water that's coming down the hill, and it's gathering and pooling in this place. You then go outside, and when you go outside, there are these giant pipes, and people are here, and then there's a railing, and then the building is again built into the hill. So when you finally go upstairs, after you look through the windows at the great landscape, and you walk out a door, and you end up outside, this is the scene then, that there's this big plinth where the water is, and here is the bath, and it steps up, and this is the planted green roof. And those little blue lights are just over here. But right away, there's a house next door, and next door, and next door. So the pictures I saw in a magazine made me think it was on its own, standing alone, but it's actually part of the village of Vals, and that's a very different reading, and it's still very much a Swiss tradition to go and use the baths. So it's not a special place in any way. It's actually the extension to the village bath. And this is the roof. It has a piece that's controlled for the railing. I actually put this one in for David Pearson because of our green roof discussion. But this is a beautiful green roof because it's planted here. Blueberries from Sudbury grow there. No, blueberries from BC can't grow here, but ours could grow over there. So, and then because the bath is carved out, you have part of it that's just grown, part of it that then they cut the grass, and then that line right here, the landscape of the building continues invisibly to the landscape beyond. And it's masterful because he does things again like steps, the stone stops, it's capped by a concrete beam, and then there's a metal edge for that roof, and then part of it you can walk along. It's all controlled, and controlled meaning it's orchestrated, the experience, And finally then, you can get back far enough from a room, because you can stay there too. That's a terrace in one of the rooms that he didn't do that overlooks the roof. And there's those little blue lights. So they're the only thing. They're the size of your Luxo lamps. They just come up, they point down like a flower, and they shine down into that blue main pool. And then the village is all the way here, and you go climbing up as your daily activities there. And yet, from the other side, it's clearly not hidden in the sense of the roof, but now this is a plane of stone, and even the windows are controlled, so there's no frames. The plates of glass are right in line with this, and when it rains, you get these lovely effects of the rain on the hills. So this project Gabri didn't speak about, but if I am tracing that line of buildings that kind of work with sites, remake themselves, respond to local traditions, they're an extension of the local from the ground up, they're not things that are imported, then this would be the next in that series. And Gabri's cathedral, that St. Boniface Cathedral, 1967, I said, when it burnt down, this project was never shown to any of us that I know in school, and yet we'd go to Italy to see something by Carlo Scarpa, but it's just down the road in Winnipeg. And when they stabilized this, he talked a little bit about that. The cathedral had a large fire, and then he built this other church, which you see a glimpse of, behind the facade. And the beauty of it, the lesson in this one, is that he didn't over-design it. It's another one of the important lessons, I would say, that how much of something do you have to do, and if you do too much, you'll go into overkill and it'll be too done. And you worked on your chiseling last week to partly experience this. One of the students said, I kept chiseling and chiseling, got so carried away at the end there was hardly anything left. That's that design problem. And now if you're at this scale, how do you tackle that? And one of the things you would want to hope is that you would be restrained enough to understand to leave things where they need to be and then intervene where you need to. This is nice just because it's full of weddings, so this gives a new take on walking down the aisle, because you walk through this empty cathedral getting to the church at the other end, and it's a garden. These are the bells. So the bell tower collapsed, so he took this new truss and put the bells now horizontally running through the depth of the facade and the old window that was destroyed in the fire. That's the space that you start to stand in, and the new church is still in front of this image, but this thing frames the sky. This becomes a backdrop for all kinds of photography and experiencing the site. And then this is the kind of thing that he did almost 50 years ago to stabilize it by putting these concrete buttresses, like a Gothic church would have them on the outside, but these are on the inside, and they really to stabilize the wall. So he didn't do more than he needed to. He kind of let it be broken, capped it, and then built the new church that we'll see in a minute. That's the new church. So part of the program was that when it burnt down, it held about 1,000 people, and they said the congregation was getting smaller anyway, so he had a budget to do a church for 500 people. So it got smaller, and that rather than go somewhere else again and relocate, he said, let's build the new church inside the nucleus of the old one. And these are lights. These are metal lights that vent and have light in here at night. But that's the old silhouette. And he built the church to the east end because the altar and the apse had remained. And then there's a nice detail where the new copper roof comes down, and he kind of built these, old steps, got replaced by some of these, so they're more like places to sit, experience the site, see it as a ruin, but also still come around the corner into the new church, and that relationship of the roof, a big sloping roof compared to the roof that would have been the basilica roof before. So then the stone, because the new church then was based on stone for the base, and then this copper, as I say, turns the corner, became the roof. This almost has a Frank Lloyd Wright feeling of bringing down the copper and the flashing, and then having the rainwater leader come down into this carved piece of stone, and then that takes the water back out onto the grass, and that goes all the way around the perimeter of the old church. So very minimal, very restrained, and the lesson I think in that, as a young architect then, was something that was very controlled and not easy to achieve. And now, next in the sequence would be this great building that was a find for me in Bologna, and it's the Oratory of San Filippo Neri. It was from the 1600s, and it's one of these, what had been, this little tiny church at the back, about 2 blocks from Bologna Cathedral, and in the middle of the street, you don't see much from the street except a minor facade, and then when you came in, you had this as the first apse on the way in. Next. Then the bombs came in World War II and hit it and destroyed it. And that's a story too in architecture, that there's a process of time, and reconstruction doesn't just mean going back and trying to pretend that history didn't happen, but how do you move forward in a way that lets you see the scars and the traces of history, and then still make something new that's about today that understands where it came from. That's a fairly profound idea, easy to say in language, much harder to do in material. Next. So this shows you how badly it was damaged. Next. So the cathedral in St. Boniface kind of burned, and Gabory said he had images of the way the steel all crumbled around it and so on. So he had images of that destruction when he made the new church. And here, from World War II, as I say, this shows it knocked the floor out of the main church. All of this got broken. They stripped it back, and then they started to stabilize it after 1945. Next. And as they reworked it, the Italian workers, went in with the idea they were kind of rebuilding the church as it had been, or the oratory as it had been. So you can start to see things like, the old stone carved capitals now and the old plaster will start having this new revetment of brick, that flat Bologna brick laid on that. Next. And so there's a layer of the original, and then there's this layer that we just showed of the brick, and what they started to do was columns that had been carved in stone or covered in plaster, they started to pour in concrete, because now that was the material after the war. So they poured columns like this to match, you see it, try to match the structure and also to hold up the roof because they needed to put a new roof. Next. So this is original, let's say, 1700s. This is now the reconstruction after the war with a poured column. And then they did things like they built the balcony back on here in wood with these other struts, and they were about to plaster all that and try to match it. And then this fantastic architect from Venice came along called Pierluigi Cavalletti in 1997, and he said, I actually want to complete the rest of the church because it wasn't ever finished, but what he completed actually lets us see the history of the three stages, meaning the original, the World War II bombing, and then the reconstruction after 1945, and then the current moment. So you'll see things like this, which may look like they're unfinished, but we'll see in a moment this is a very sophisticated attitude about where the old plaster is and where the new building would let you read both of those. Next. So this is the dome. So now you come back into the oratory. They use it for concerts now. It's no longer a space of worship, but it's the area of Emilia-Romagna, local dialect in Italy, and they have these Emilia-Romagna singing contests in here, and we got to go to a couple of those. So there's this big church now, Filippo Neri painting, and then this dome, you can see it really well here, that the arch gets built in brick, and then this wooden dome has a brick ring, and it comes to meet this new wood. So that wood, even here, they're not going to plaster that in the future. That's the attitude about letting us see. He said a very profound thing, Cavalletti, when they asked him, how did you come to this architectural resolution? He said, we can't pretend that history didn't happen. I want it to be seen then, I want it to be experienced now, and I want us to move forward to the future. So, next. So that's an example of looking up in the vault that had all been damaged from the shock waves, and that's the wooden structure of the roof looking straight up. And then here's what it looks like today. Next. So that's that same look. It's an exceptional project in that people like Carlo Scarpa get talked about because he plays the old off the new, and if you have a round arch in a Venetian building, he'll put a square door in front of that larger to play the two of them off each other. But what's fantastic here, look how careful that is, and I'll come back to that farmer's accuracy from Seamus Heaney. One has to be incredibly accurate to be able to put that wood in place and make this a reference to the dome space and this different geometry here, and build this rib across the main arch, but they stop the plaster. Here's another good example. You're spiraling that wood around, and then someone has to carve that and taper it and end it here. And they didn't say, take all that plaster out and let's build a new superstructure. Not an easy thing to photograph this building, but in fact, the space, when you sit in there, and the acoustics, it's very narrow and small. Can we go to the next one? It gives you a feeling that you constantly look up and you see the old Baroque detailing, and then you see that brick ring, and then again how someone has had to carefully measure You know, I know there's buildings in town here, of course, where people were careful enough to kind of take the profile of the rock and measure and cut every step so it fits the profile of something. That's the same lesson. And it's that kind of care that lets somebody understand that you can have the reading of the old and this can be contemporary, and together they're telling a narrative and a story about the time and the traces of the events that happen that frame our lives and frame the building story. Next. And then they left, he didn't take out the concrete and the brickwork that was done from the 40s is also left. So that's another trace. So that's the original, and then the reconstruction, and now this piece. And it really is just a ceiling. And so it works very well acoustically, and it's great for concerts, and it's a very modest little place. But I called him because I was so impressed by this building, and I wanted to know how he came to this understanding. So I looked around Bologna, and I was in a bookstore, and someone said, I heard you talking about that building. We know the architect. So we phoned him in Venice and got to have a nice phone conversation asking him, how did you come to this understanding? And he said, well, I graduated from the University of Venice, and I studied with Carlo Scarpa, which wasn't a surprise. But Scarpa's work, when you get to it as architecture students, is much more rich in materials and in detailing, and sometimes almost fetishistic, meaning he goes very far in what he's doing with the details. And what's brilliant about this project is it's just enough to stabilize, and it doesn't do anything extra. It's at that limit of where the old meets the new, and they're both authentic. And that's the dome. Okay. I won't really explain any of these. I just want to show a series of student work. I can't do this part. Can you just hit them in a kind of sequence? Models, these are from student works in Dalhousie. The lessons now are applied in that we took things like we made machines, we made mosaics. If you want to build an arch, we built an arch. These are the lessons I've taken from all that first part of the talk. We went to places like Rome, looked through keyholes, did drawings, made geometries, made machines from looking at Italian books and making the machine. And it's a way, in a studio sense, to simulate that we're not really making the buildings, but it was a way to get a certain method and a kind of way of being accurate, precise. Stop there for a sec. That's an interesting one because that's Prague. And we would build a course, would be something like a history of cities, and we would build a piece of the city. So not just a building in isolation, but a whole piece of the fabric. And as we did that, this one tries to show the procession march of the kings that would go across the Charles Bridge and up into the cathedral where they would get crowned. But the model is a nice piece because they actually lit it. And if you look really carefully, there's dots which are poked into that, and they represent throngs of people coming to watch the kings at the coronation. So what I've developed over years in different ways is being able to work with students that allows them to test things through the models, and they become a kind of experimental representation to see how do you capture a crowd crossing a bridge, or what was a procession route like. They talk about it all the time in Prague, but what does that route actually look like? And so if it's the same color as the model, you can't read it. If you light it from below, you start getting this sense of something ephemeral, like a procession or a parade, but that's a piece of the city, and actually the shape of the city came out of that narrative in that story. Next. That one I'll say something about. Siena, those of you that know in Italy, everybody in architecture knows this Il Campo, one of the great European squares, certainly in Italy, and its shape is like a dish. But the first model we built, rather than just rush to that, is the model that let us see how the slopes of the hills in that surrounding area of Siena creates this dish that's naturally in the topography. And again, that's a lesson about starting with place and site before you start to see that shape's not arbitrary. Someone didn't draw on a napkin a moon. It's actually very much the dish of the bowl of the valley, and then they pave it, and then they make a fountain, and then they slope the paving to it, and then they build a Gothic council house in front of it, and that's one way to kind of teach architectural history. That's the other thing. These were all history courses, so rather than write essays about these places, if you build them, you have a very different hands-on understanding of it. And then when we would go to places together later, students over the years would present what they had studied earlier. So the group that did Siena, we'd land there a few years later, and then they would teach us the lesson that they remembered from studying Siena. So that was the method here. The historian that taught me at this school actually had studied with Nicholas Pevsner, and he's one of the famous architectural historians, the one who said that, you know, a bicycle shed is building and a cathedral is architecture. That always troubled me. And so when I succeeded this man in teaching history, I proposed to teach history through making models and drawings. And then we also write too. It's not we're against writing, but the writing wasn't the primary mode, because I wanted to see if you actually built a model of something like that last Filippo Neri place I showed. If you built that model, you would remember that very different in a phenomenal way, viscerally, than if you just read about it. So that was a method that developed at Dalhousie to teach the history course in the key of design, if you will. And it had very interesting results, because then the relationship between design studio and the history course became much more integral. Because before that, in my era, you hated going to the history class because you had to memorize a bunch of building names and dates, and then you forgot them, largely, unfortunately. But this way is very different, because once you know that that Siena dish is the shape from the topography, no matter where you go, no matter what year it was built, no matter what size it was, you'll actually have a bodily memory of the space of that. And when you finally go to visit there, I've gotten many, many postcards over the years from people saying, I studied that place, and now here we are 10 years later, and now I'm standing in it, and I still remember that discussion we had in class. And that's proof, and you know, that supports the idea that it's a very different hands-on bodily experience that has to do with sensation. That's why I say we oscillate. Architecture oscillates between language and sensation, and I think you need them both, and you need to cultivate them both in an integrated way. Next. That's made out of chocolate. We'll just stop on that one. That's Vienna, the Ringstrasse in Vienna. And the next slide, that's the chocolate model lit at night on a light table, and then the chocolate melted when they did their presentation because they lit it. And then we all had fondue, which was a nice way to think about the Ringstrasse, because it was one of those decadent projects in Vienna in the 19th century, so that was funny. They were Austrian students on exchange, and they loved the fact that they could bring chocolate and make a model in Canada. And they went home and told everybody that we probably live in chocolate houses or something silly. Next. And then sketchbooks. I mean, we're talking in studio about the idea of sketching, and that ways of seeing means we train ourselves to see. Next. So this one, that model, stop there for a sec. That takes us back now. So in studying Havana, so over the years, I kind of moved away from European history discussions and moved towards places that were, you know, troubled by floods, destroyed by waves, suppressed by politicians and governments. Bologna also, right? It was the red city, and red in both its color of brick but also communist. So we started with Bologna, then we moved to Havana, and then we had a really important political discussion about what it means in these houses. So these are old courtyard houses in Havana, and it used to be for one family, and by the time you get to this era, 10 or 20 families are living in them. So they move in and they divide a floor, so it might be 10 feet tall, and they divide it with a mezzanine and have two areas that are 5 feet tall to be able to get in there and occupy it. And all along the seawall in Havana, they built the buildings out of sea concrete, and they used sea salt in the concrete, and that causes 3 buildings a month to just pulverize. You walk down the street and a building's there one day and gone the next, and when they crumble, they just fully collapse. And when they collapse, they often kill everybody in the buildings, and because this is now that equivalent of that story in Lima, it's people with no money, can't own housing, they're living in these buildings, and the government knows that those buildings are actually very unsafe and unfit, but they continue, that continues. And so this model was trying to show a courtyard house unfolded, so we'll just go on. And all the stuff they have to bring to it, TV antennas, they have to buy water, they have to jimmy things, they have to share electricity. So it took us back. This is, again, the next one. That's, you know, from wire, those spools for wire that you have around. So people will make things like this and make go-karts. And why would you be an architecture student making that? But that was a way in to the project to see that if you started making those things and then doing drawings in the area, that was a way, again, through the material culture, to see what limitations there are and yet what creativity comes out of that limited resources. Next. That's one of those buildings. This one here is one of those. You see the scaffolding usually indicates it's starting to collapse, and then many, many families live in here, and then, as I say, 3 a month is a statistic 5 years ago that just collapse. And then back to Montreal. So the method is not a style as much as trying to train ourselves to see that the way you record things matters and makes a difference. And in being able to make a model like this, the person didn't do the drawing first. They made the model. They did a series of studies on stairways in Montreal. They studied laneways in their structure. And by the time they get to this model, then it's not just a flat building on a flat desk. It's got a topography. It follows a slope. It has spaces to store things and park under. And then there's a sophisticated building section, which goes along with that drawing. Next. And these again, these little spiral stairs in Montreal that were part of a building law, bylaw. They didn't allow stairs at first in Montreal. Then they said they had to be outside in a certain decade. And then they put them back inside in the 50s. And in that area, you get all these things that are the kind of local, flavor and character of a street in Montreal. So people would study the light and shadow, the steel, how they're attached, to be able to then design something else, like a stair in this loft, or a stair going up into a building, or passing through 2 different buildings and connecting them. Next. And then I'll end on drawing, but because the way we represent things matters so much, and the way we study them matters because it leads to the representations that we make. A fellow that drew beautifully named Chris was doing this study, and he wanted to draw like medieval monks would draw the courtyard, but they would also draw the side elevations at the same time in these flat medieval drawings before perspective. And so he was doing an elective with me studying the bottom, and then his wife got all excited, and she said, well, I have a drawing. Can you show Terry my drawing? Because I drew our living room too. And what's really interesting, because she's an untrained eye, is that she's standing in the middle of the living room on the carpet, and so she draws the carpet and draws that wall. And now she looks at the next wall, but she's standing on the carpet, so she draws the carpet and she draws that wall. And she's standing on the carpet and she draws that wall, right? It's a brilliant thing. If you were John Hayduck, you'd win design awards for this. But if you were, and so Chris, who had worked for like 3 months on this drawing and was very proud of it, was completely usurped by his wife sending me this drawing and said, what do you think of this drawing? I said, that's brilliant. Like, it's an elevation, it's a plan, you've got your table, and your carpet with your cat keeps appearing 4 times in a row. So the naive, the question of the naive and how we cultivate our sight, it shouldn't leave a tradition. That's why I showed all the first slides of the buildings. Those are all, in the positive sense, traditions get passed on. Many of the times they're oral. Many of the times are the way you learn something from somebody. It's why we need, trades to continue in places so that those knowledges get passed on. Elders, many, many examples of that. And so that relationship, I'm always searching, there's a kind of tension between where does the naive, untrained eye end, or does it end, or does it have to end, and can you actually then come back and be trained, but not lose that sense of a kind of curiosity, naivete, directness, that farmer's accuracy. And the last one, can we just go to the next image? I'm ending on this self-expression, next one. So, Marco Frescari is a man that was a great teacher of mine, and he was at Carleton. He just died in June. But in between, he had a stroke, and he did this little book of drawings after his stroke. And these are they. And because he couldn't talk anymore, but he drew all his life as an architect, and he was a fantastic drawer. He was paralyzed on one side, so he had to learn to draw with his other hand. And because he couldn't explain to anyone, he couldn't even talk to his wife, and he also forgot. When he started to speak, he forgot English and could only respond to things in a few Italian words. He did this little set of drawings for himself, but they published them to try to raise money for him when he was sick. But this drawing, I won't try to explain them, but I'll just say that the deep impulse in architecture and the reason why we make things is because there's this sense of self-expression. So we'll go to the next one. So even when you can't talk and you're trying to draw and you're trapped in your own body, there's this sense that you have to express yourself. And he's searching for himself in relation to the world. Next. And that's the last one of those 3. There were many, many more. But in each of those drawings, why? do you keep drawing when you've lost your speech, lost your will? There's something in that I think is throughout the thread of all of this. We all make things, and we try to have this sense of self-expression because it's one of the great things about the human will. And I'll end, not to explain those, but I think it works nicely with Czesław Miłosz, the Nobel Prize-winning poet. They asked him, why do you write poetry? And he answered this when he gave his Nobel talk. And if you think of those drawings in relation to this, one might say, I write poetry or I draw because, he says, I'm to find my home in one sentence, concise, as if hammered in metal, not to enchant anybody, not to earn a lasting name in posterity, an unnamed need for order, for rhythm, for form, which three words are opposed to chaos and nothingness. Thank you.